has introduced a bill in the House that would block the purchase of Chinese chip-making equipment by CHIPS Act grant recipients for 10 years. The bill targets a range of chip-making tools from complex lithography equipment like that produced by Dutch manufacturer ASML to machines that slice and dice the silicon wafers on which chips are printed. Though Chinese equipment is a main target of the legislation, the bill also blocks tools from other nations of concern, such as Iran, Russia, and North Korea. Meanwhile, the U.S. Justice Department has charged 4 people in a scheme to illegally export Nvidia AI chips to China, prompting a key House Republican to call for urgent passage of a chip tracking bill. The legislation, which Molina introduced in May and has 30 co-sponsors and would require location verification for chips, making it mandatory for chip makers to report and share information about potential diversion and look at additional ways to stop U.S. chips from ending up in the wrong hands. The indictment, which the U.S. Department of Justice announced, charges 2 U.S. citizens and 2 Chinese nationals with conspiring to export Nvidia GPUs to China without requiring licenses. All right, so I have Stephen back with me. Now, Stephen, we're getting our viewers details of this latest development there as well. What would you like to say on that?
So I think we should understand that the competition between the United States and China is very much not only about security, but about technology. Who's going to be able to dominate the new tools of the 21st century, and that's AI and quantum computing. Both of these require the most sophisticated chips. And what we've seen is the United States is really at the forefront in having the most powerful and sophisticated chips that are built mostly in Taiwan. But they're built through a collection of products. And as you mentioned, there's a Dutch company that's really important in terms of lithography. The Japanese are really important in terms of making the wafers. The United States are really the software producers, and Taiwan mixes it all up like a chef and puts this amazing product together. So if the United States wants to continue to be at the forefront and dominate AI and quantum computing, which I think it absolutely does, and it wants to outpace China, then it has to put controls on all the different technologies. And what you didn't mention in your coverage was the movement of engineers as well. People that have worked in this field, if they are allowed to go and work in China and then come back to Australia or the United States or Canada, the knowledge and the techniques will be transferred to China. I think it's important for us to understand what does this all mean. Really, the country that dominates AI and quantum computing are going to really set the table of how technologies move for the next 50 or 100 years. What kinds of medicines are going to be produced? What kinds of defense equipment will be produced? AI enables the winner of this race to produce the most sophisticated technologies that can outpace a competitor, and that's the stakes. That's why the U.S. is blocking all of this. But I believe that the United States is willing to work with India and Canada and Australia and other countries that have shared national interests and shared concerns about what an authoritarian state would do with this kind of power.
All right, Stephen. And now, of course, Stephen, there's also another point that must be mentioned here, which is that the bill also blocks tools from other nations of concern, such as Iran, Russia, and North Korea as well. How do you see that?
Well, we've seen growing alignment between these 4 countries over the past 3 or 4 years. Since Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, we've seen China, through third countries, provide technologies to allow Russia's war machine to continue to manufacture the goods that are necessary for war. We've seen alignment with North Korea and Russia in terms of Russia likely providing satellite technology, some other technology for the North Koreans to refine their missile launching systems and their ICBMs, and the reentry technology that is important for these kinds of systems. And we've seen Iran also transfer technologies, in particular drones, to the front line of Ukraine. So these countries really are working together. how well they can work together in this space of technology and semiconductors is important to study. It's also important for us to make sure that they can't cooperate and those technologies are not flooding into their countries so that they can bypass some of the curbs that the United States and other countries are likely to adopt to, again, keep ahead of in the competition over AI and quantum computing.
Stephen, I'd request you to stay on with me. Now, Russia and China have held in-depth talks in Moscow this week, focusing on missile defense and strategic stability. Both countries have agreed to strengthen cooperation in these areas amid concerns over the U.S. plans to develop a missile shield and resume nuclear testing. The discussions also addressed global and regional security risks and ways to minimize them. The two nations expressed satisfaction with the current level of dialogue and committed to further strengthening their bilateral relationship. This meeting comes as the U.S. and Russia face a deadline in February for the expiration of the last remaining nuclear treaty between the two countries. And I have my guest, Stephen, back with me. Now, Stephen, of course, Russia and China have held in-depth talks in Moscow. And, of course, they're focusing on missile defense and strategic stability. I'd like your comments.
So Russia and China are obviously concerned about the growing strength of the United States and its partners, especially since the Trump administration has come back into power. We've seen President Trump really cajole the Europeans and the NATO to spend up to 5% of GDP on NATO defense spending. He's cajoled the Canadians, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and others. So from Russia and China's point of view, that they need to find ways to cooperate on missile defense, deterrence, but I think it's important for us to also understand that there's limits to their cooperation. Russia does have strong concerns about China's long-term intentions in terms of the Far East. Often in closed-door discussions, there's slips of tongue by Chinese counterparts that talk about Eastern Russia actually being Chinese, and that this should return to China in one day. These are big concerns, and I think the Russians see that there's limits to the cooperation with China, but at the same time they need Chinese aid to continue to prosecute their war with Ukraine. On the Chinese side, they see opportunity as Russia needs a strong Chinese partner, so they're continuing to strengthen their relationship and develop technology exchanges, ensure there's cheap energy going into the Chinese economy, and likely some technology. They're going to be continue to be aligned, but I think there's limits to their alignment. And the importance, I think, is for the United States and partners to try to find ways to divide these two states in the way that they work to divide the United States and Canada, Japan and the United States, and India and the United States.
Thank you, Stephen, for joining me on the broadcast. And now a U.S. Treasury official says that Chinese and Indian banks and refineries are moving to comply with the U.S. sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil companies. The Trump administration imposed sanctions last month on Lukoil and Rosneft in an effort to cut revenues Moscow uses for its nearly 4-year-old war on Ukraine. China and India are the top buyers of Russian oil. According to officials, many entities in both countries are described as risk-averse and acknowledge the importance of their relations with Western countries. I have my guest joining me on the broadcast, Andrew K.P. Leong, China strategist, and he's joining me from Hong Kong. Now, Andrew, this is, of course, a big move. And how do you see the U.S. Treasury official say that Indian and banks and refineries are moving to comply with the U.S. sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil companies?
Could you repeat the question? Because I was there was a connection disconnect, so I couldn't hear the question very well.
Sure, Andrew, not a problem at all.
Yeah. Right.
Now, we're talking about the U.S. Treasury official who said that Chinese and Indian banks and refineries are moving to comply with the U.S. sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil companies. So I'd like your comments on that.
Well, I think that the economies of Russia and China have been joined at the hip for a very, very long time, long before the Ukraine war, because Russia is the world's largest, one of the world's largest energy exporter, and China is the largest energy customer. Um, and so the economies, and also not only energy but agricultural products. Russia is the world's largest exporter of fertilizers and of course other agricultural products. China also has been the world's largest customer. So so I think that the two economies have been joined at the hip for a long time, but because of the war on Ukraine, China doesn't want to be seen to be supporting the war because the war on Ukraine tramples upon a fundamental principle which China's government has been adhering to, which is national territorial sovereignty. For example, it underlines China's claim over the islands in the South China Sea and also China's consistent claim of sovereignty over Taiwan. So I think that the Chinese government is unlikely to support this open transgression of this fundamental principle enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Now, however, unlike the case of India, which started to buy Russian oil in large quantities only after the Ukraine war, China has been carrying out purchases as normal. However, because of the international pressure, China is likely to send a signal to the West that China is helping in a way to help for an early resolution of the Ukraine conflict. This is also helped by China's less reliance on fossil fuel because over 50% of China's electricity supply is now supplied by green energy, by wind power, solar power, hydropower. Over 50% of China's electricity supply is now accounted for by domestic green energy. So China would be buying less oil anyway from any country. And so I think China is in a good position to buy less oil. Now, as for sanctions, of course, China doesn't subscribe to the use of sanctions, especially indiscriminate sanctions to even Western allies and the world over and other countries in the global south. So I think that China is likely to oppose these sanctions, the use of sanctions as a tool, as a part of the United States long-armed American exceptionalism. So I think that this is a nuanced response. I think that China is treading a thin red line there.
Andrew, I'd request you to stay on with me. I'll come back to you. Now, China and Kyrgyzstan have taken a major